morning, everyone, and welcome to the reminder meeting of HCD. There are people that there are seats for everyone. There's one more seat up here, one more seat in there. Just encourage everybody to sort of find your way. So we have a very full agenda today, and we're going to try to get through it. Are we still hoping for the high impact site folks to be here at 11? We're here. Oh, you're here. Oh, okay. Well, all right, well, that's good. I'm not sure I want to, we need to get to some of this other stuff, so we'll just try to get through first. All right, so we'll start with approval of the minutes.
Motion to approve the minutes.
All right, the minutes are approved. And then updates. Does anybody have any questions about the updates? We have the memos from staff. One thing I just want to flag for everyone on the CDBG, the memo indicates that apparently the federal government might have made a mistake in how much CDBG money they allocated out, and they are reconfiguring that at this point. So that could change for us. It could be more, it could be less, it could be the same, but just want to make sure that everybody's aware that that's an issue that's out there, and we might need to do something about it. Anything else?
Yes, I'd just like to add that this is national, not just national. So it's all the grantees around the country, it's a reallocation process, and probably before the end of the summer, I imagine.
And actually, I'm going to start over because we have Michael Blair here, sitting in this seat for the first time. Michael is the new Director of Community Development. What's the title? Okay, good. He's the new Jeff, he's the new Heather, and he's the new Jeff. Right. So you want to just take a second and introduce yourself to everyone?
Absolutely. I've been here for about 2 weeks, and we were in the Piedmont Tribe Regional Council of Governments, which is based in Connersville. And in that role, we had a home program, similar to what Asheville has, Section 8 housing program, and also rehabilitation programs, housing compensation, so part of that Greensboro, and I'm just happy to be here and working with the regional.
Right, any questions on this?
I don't have any questions about the updates right now, but in the foreseeable future, I would love to have an oral presentation and an update on the Eagle Marketplace, about the discussions that they continue, and regarding the structures and financing, not at this meeting, but possibly at the top of the year.
Those conversations are ongoing. And I had a question about Cedar Hill. So I think there's, no, maybe it's over. All right, no other questions about updates? And we will move on to unfinished business. So everyone, I think, is aware that we had invited a conversation with our CDBG and SPF grantees about implementing a range of possible new criteria for that. There was a meeting, I guess last month or earlier this month, and we've gotten the feedback from that, and we have a memo on that. Megan or anybody else, do you want to talk to us about that, or should we just dive into that conversation?
Well, this is Michael again. That was my first day. It was October 29th. Was the evening we go over the
options for how we deal with this today. We can go ahead and make a decision on new criteria, or we can discuss it and make decisions at our next meeting if we want to. The applications, I think, will open up before our next meeting, but not too long before our next meeting, so that we could still, we can still do that. We can still make a decision and I think still be timely for the applications. But let's do have a conversation about it. I have a couple of observations that I'll share from the surveys and the written comments, and that is, I would agree with you, Michael, that there seemed to be a tremendous amount of interest in setting aside some portion of either SPF or CDBG funding for capacity building, to strengthen organizations, and I'm a huge supporter of capacity building. I think, you know, as we're trying to make all of the organizations that serve our community stronger, increase their capacity to do great work. In my other life, running a nonprofit, I'm a direct beneficiary of significant investment in capacity building. I know what it can do. There are other organizations in the room. Homeward Bound is the same way. Green Opportunities is the same way. We can point to organizations, many in this city, who used to be very small and are now significant in size and scope and capacity. And if we have money to spend on that to help smaller organizations grow in that way and access significant amount of funding from other places other than the city, that to me is a no-brainer. So that's one recommendation that I would sort of put on the table specifically, is to set aside some of that, some money, either some of each or maybe just SPF for that. The other thing that I noticed in going through the surveys is that there was also, and here's the way I did it. If y'all saw the surveys, people ranked things in terms of order of importance. And I just added up, or had written down, everything that got more than 50% of the people who voted ranked it either as a 4 or a 5. So it's pretty important. And so the only other things that really got significant support from that perspective were things like, you know, requiring 501c3 status, or an application to get that, compliance with North Carolina law, good governance. So again, sort of things around capacity. Those are also sort of related to capacity building, but I would, again, overwhelming support for putting those kinds of things in place. And then there was also more than 50% support for having grantees have sources of funding other than just the city funds. So that's just based on a majority of kind of the respondents, those are the things that I would put on the table. I do also like the recommendation for tiered levels for SPF applications, where people just come in at either 5,000, 10,000, 15 million, or whatever. I think that it takes away some flexibility from this group, but I think it also creates maybe some more clarity for the grantees. So those are the things that jumped out at me.
I would agree with what you put forward. I know the community has been talking a lot about capacity building and doing a lot of workshops and gathering information about how to scale up, but not actually having the opportunity or funding to do that. So I believe that it would be
cleaning these meetings, we're gonna invite you, as opposed to just standing up where you are in the audience like we normally do, to come up to the microphone so that the hundreds of people, thousands of fans of HTV that are out there can also hear you. So anybody have any other comments? Nicole? And you know the drill, just tell us who you are.
I'm Nicole Rimbaugh with Benefit Cities. And I just wanted to say that my recommendation is that as we're looking at these recommendations, to weigh carefully the actual experience of organizations in complying with new requirements. In other words, we want organizations and work to be as successful as possible. And also, we want to be careful not to create even more regulatory burdens than what already exists. And so, while the SPF process has a huge degree of flexibility, because it comes from the general fund, and the CDBG process does not have a huge degree of flexibility, I would recommend looking at, taking the opportunity to look at SPF in a way that truly does support the organizations and the work, as opposed to simply instilling more accountability measures, because accountability measures aren't necessarily the problem. So I just wanted to offer that as we're potentially imposing more regulatory burdens, to maybe think about that in terms of capacity building, and not something that could create a barrier to organizations being able to access funds and adequately
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think that's certainly not my intention. I don't think that's the intention of anybody. The kinds of things that I think we're talking about are really aimed at, again, enhancing the capacity and the stability of organizations we're looking for. So we definitely don't want to create anything, but helping organizations do the things that they are doing. And I think you can do any of the three microphones.
Okay, Brian Betzman from Homeward Bound. Really 2 points. One, organizations like ours have used the CDBG funding as a long-term source of revenue to perform functions largely on behalf of the city, like we do for coordinated entry for the homeless population, where we're doing assessment of people for all the agencies in the community, which is a HUD requirement. So if there are limits put on spending or term limits on receiving funding, we'll need to work with the city to find other ways of embedding those things in the city budget in order for us to continue to do that work on behalf of the community. Because it's not a reasonable burden to place it on our donors to do things for activities on behalf of other nonprofits in the community. It's very difficult for us to backfill that type of funding. Second thing is more from as a community member and a board member of many nonprofits, I think when the city takes on the capacity building thing, you're taking on kind of an incubator approach for figuring out which nonprofits you ought to be investing in. And you really want to be doing that for a long-term approach, because the goal is to grow them into more groups like Homeward Bound that started out as a small, $100,000 organization and has grown into a $5 million organization doing a lot of good in the community. But you really have to figure out who you're investing in. And that means the city doing vetting in terms of not only their mission, but the board that's behind them and the people that are behind them, and taking a long-term approach, a multi-year approach to funding them. Because if you just do it for 1 year, building capacity in a single year is extremely difficult as a nonprofit. So I would look at 2 or 3 year funding streams for these more nascent organizations, rather than just focusing on a single $50,000 grant to someone, because that's unlikely to get them the momentum that they need to continue to grow and serve the community.
Any other comments? All right. Michael, anything else that you want to add to this on the staff perspective?
In my former roles, I did have a lot of responsibility for funding those CDBG and emergency shelter, emergency services grants,
staff recommendations, which I think are good. So one of the staff recommendations is that funds be made available for capacity building for SBF, and I'm gonna go ahead and include CDBG grant recipients. And I'm not gonna suggest a particular amount of funding. I'm happy for the staff to sort of look at that pot of SPF money and see what makes sense. We also would need to figure out how that money is used. Is that, are we, is that just a pot of money that's available, or do we actually sort of, contract with nonprofit pathways or Hisba Legal or Green Opportunities that has also done some capacity building for groups to, sort of voluntarily come forward and say, I need help with building my board, or I need help with, setting up QuickBooks, or I need help with filing my 501c3 application. We need to figure out how that,
Exactly, what the format is.
what the format is.
I did like the idea of the 2 or 3 year capacity grant. I mean, it does make sense. I mean, because capacity building is not one person coming in for a 2-day period, and all of a sudden we've got everything is running very smoothly. So I think the mission.
Yeah, and there's also, I think, a question of, is it a pot of money that are we granting out this money to groups individually, or is it a pot of money that any grantee can access to get the particular service that they need?
That was a question during the meeting. And I think the preference would be that it would be not from the grants themselves, not from the pockets itself. And I don't know what feasibility is. So,
I think at this point, the only thing we can do is talk about setting aside some of the pot that we have. We're not in a position to commit the city to more than the money that's been budgeted. So, if that changes, then that changes. But right now, we have what we have. So I would recommend pulling off a piece of that, and then, again, there are different ways it can be structured. And I also think that groups could always include in their, if they wanted to, in their grant application, a little, some money for capacity building if that's what they want to do. That other grantees have done that. The challenge that we have here is that our main capacity building organization, which is Western North Carolina Nonprofit Pathways, their higher level services are only available to organizations with revenue of $100,000, which doesn't cover a lot of the groups that we fund. It does cover many of the groups that we fund, but we're really talking about those groups that are under $100,000. How do we, so I think there needs to be some more conversation around that structure, and what that amount would be, but I'm happy for you guys to sort of think about that and then come back with a proposal on that. So the other thing that I would like to include is, again, these are things that got more than 50% on the surveys. Were, again, requiring, and I think we already do this, but requiring 501c3 status or an application to get there. That they can demonstrate compliance with other North Carolina laws, and these are things like solicitation license, whatever other filings that you need to be in good standing with the Secretary of State's office. And again, the vision being that some of this capacity money could be put to use in helping groups meet those other requirements, which are not onerous, but they're just, it's the law. So we want to do that. I would also be interested in maybe not putting in some requirements around, number of members on the board or how many times you meet, but maybe just asking people to report that. There are grant applications that I have filled out that ask how many people you have on your board, how often do you meet, how many meetings in the last year have you had a quorum. So maybe just at this step, sort of asking for that information, and that can give a good sense of governance. How much of a role is the board really playing?
That as an indicator, I think.
And then one of the other things that got support and is part of the staff's recommendation as well is that that the city funds not be the only funding source for the, I guess for the organization, not necessarily for the project, but for the organization. And I would, I think I would support that. The city's recommendation was more specifically around the CDBG public service requests, and that those requests can't exceed a certain percentage of the overall project budget. I don't have to sense of that.
Well, I think there was, during the meeting, a couple of comments about, for the organization, more than 50% of their annual budget, or maybe come up with a easy to meet requirement there that's not project-based, organization-based.
What did you say, no more than 50% of your annual budget? I mean, obviously, you just threw that out there, but.
No, that came out, percentages came out just of the annual budget, it could be 25, yeah, it really is whatever the, board wants it to be. But the whole point of that was to ensure that other funding was being brought into the organization.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear all the opinion.
You can come back with a recommendation.
And then there is this, one of the, I think the final staff recommendation was around a tiered grant process. So what we have in front of us are awards from the last 3 years, and thank you very much, I'm going to say Megan, for pulling this together. I sent an email at 10:30 last night asking for this, so thank you very much. You know, just to give us a sense of the amount of money that has been awarded and, you know, average grants among all these categories. You know, they range from, you know, under 5,000 to 30,000, it looks like. So I think our options here are, we could just, you know, leave it the way it is, let people come in with whatever they want to request, or we could say, you've got to come in at a $5,000 level, $10,000 level, 15, 20, or 30. There seems to be some support for that at the meeting, is that right?
There was some support for that concept. I couldn't really tell you what those levels really should be. When you're looking at $5,000 grants and some $7,500 grants and $15,000 and 20. But in looking actually at what this board has done over the last couple of years, there has been some consistency in what you're funding out. So I mean, I wouldn't have an opinion specifically on that other than, a pretty consistent program for the last couple of years.
If you have any suggestions.
Well, I'm looking at these numbers. I mean, maybe the tiers are 5,000, 15,000, and 30,000. Again, what I think that would do is take away some flexibility that we have to, you know, if someone asks for 15, and as we're trying to get everybody funded, like we're always trying to do, you know, that we then wouldn't, you know, sort of drop that 15 to 12 and drop that 5 to 3, and, you know, if we say these are the amounts that you can apply for, and either it's all kind of an all or nothing, we're tying our hands a little bit. But it also creates some predictability for, maybe some better predictability for the applicants.
And I would say let's move forward with tentatively, you know, keep it in the back of our mind, maybe move forward with this process as it comes up this coming year, leave that flexibility in place, and then if we see after this next cycle that we may need to have a little bit more continuity and we know that things being awarded, then maybe take that on. But what do you think?
Okay, so we'll set that aside for now. The final staff recommendation was around whether we could narrow any of these funding priorities. This, again, thank you, Megan. I asked for the grants for the last 3 years in the different buckets of our priorities. And we have
necessarily, after looking at all this stuff, I don't necessarily have a dissenting opinion on any of the recommendations. You know, even some of the categories such as like food security and there's only. We can keep it the same. I don't necessarily see a pressing issue of narrowing it down unless staff wants to give opinion on that.
Seeing how this is the first time that we've reviewed this, I don't really have an opinion on it either. I mean, there are objectives that we have. I mean, we want these different activities to go forward, and we know what the benefits are. So, I don't really have a recommendation.
I'd be inclined to engage with anybody in the audience has an opinion on it. If not, we can move forward.
Is it based on,
He actually, because we're now being filmed, can you just come, take a seat and, sorry.
And while G is coming forward, I think y'all probably talked about the fact that we have these new devices, so we can make sure everybody gets to watch. We've gotten some feedback that unless your mic is on, Red, they can't hear you in the audience if they're watching. So you
Proc-
just make sure that if you're talking, it's on.
Proximity helps.
That's good.
Basically, I was just gonna ask, does it line up with the city's desire to diminish the disparities? Like the achievement gap, we heard a very startling report from the Asheville City School Superintendent at the NAACP the other night. Widest achievement gap among African Americans in North Carolina, while their white cohorts here in Asheville City are among the highest performing. So I'm just wondering if the city is really looking at equity, if that's something that you want to prioritize, because it's almost like an emergency. It's quite startling. And we've been collecting data as well based on the DPI report cards and doing some trend analysis here that we're going to turn over to the school system. Education is a focus area on the social determinants of health. And it looks like since we've been pinpointed as the lowest performing African American students in the state is some priority. So I just asked that because it was quite something the other night in this.
Well, and I don't know, I don't think everybody in the audience has what we're looking at, but the most groups that have, we have funded more groups in the achievement gap than in any other.
Again, my other thing was, and there was a comment, and I think I made it, I might as well make it here. I think that there needs to be some performance metrics established with these groups that come forward for funding what we call the usual suspects. Because as I said, the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same things over and over. There have been a number of groups added for not even been catering to this group, these groups of underachievers who happen to be African American. And all we've got, it looks like, is an exorbitant dropout rate. 220 students, 227 students at Asheville High School totally. My graduating class some years ago, but we had 785 seniors march and graduate. So the alarm is just a dropout rate. So I would hope that the council has some appetite for putting forth some performance metrics and holding folks accountable. Because these are, after all, taxpayer dollars. Thank you.
Yeah, I would, I can't, when, so I don't remember, I don't clearly remember, when we review these applications, if we also get a good report on the accomplishments that have been done under previous grants. I think that there's more in the CDBG side than there maybe is on the SPF side. I can't quite remember, but beefing up the reporting on the varies widely among applicants and even among different, different sections, but just, I think having that to be a little bit clear would be helpful.
I can, but just a little bit from experience, saying that it is the challenge for you. Some groups, applications serve fewer people but have a greater level of engagement, or the needs are proportionally higher than those serving others. And what is I think for all groups, even experienced ones, trying to determine appropriate outcomes rather than outputs, rather than just the number of people served, or how many people attended a meeting, or how many parents showed up. It's like, what are really the appropriate outcomes that show success? And, you know, a lot of these grants have served through the years, preschool students, elementary school students, junior high students, but there's no longitudinal study of what has happened to those individual students that were served through the years, to no fault of the organization serving them or the city. But if there were best practices that could be explored as part of perhaps the consultation process that you make as you review these applications, perhaps that could be helpful.
I think, as it pertains to the talk of the achievement gap and the number of organizations that we funded in this category, we're trying to figure out how do you determine success. I think, you know, we have a meeting coming up pretty soon with the school board, and if we're talking about the achievement gap, how about we let them determine what success is and how success is measured on their end, and we just plug in instead of trying to go through like exactly. And so, you know, speak with the superintendent and school board members and how they will determine the program's success as it pertains to what the direct reflection is in the classroom, and if people are passing and are on grade level or whatever they determine that to be, and then plug that into our process and say, you know, here's what your organization, if you are coming in wanting funding for achievement gap, then these are some of the outcomes that your program might need to have. Otherwise, you might want to come in at another specific area because you're not meeting the criteria of what we deem as being successful in closing the achievement gap.
So I think that's going to be something we're going to have to work on, not for this round, but for next round. The Vice Mayor had welcomed you to the microphone. Thank you for attending our meeting.
Thank you, appreciate it. Wow, this is tall. That was exactly what my suggestion was going to be, is I've talked to the superintendent, and they are more than willing to look at the programs and assist this, this committee as well as city council in looking at the various applicants that are trying to help address the achievement gap and making sure that those programs are aligned with the individual teachers involved, and they're ready to do this now. So,
We actually could sort of
I think,
create that additional, I don't necessarily want to call it an additional level of review, but for those applications that come in for the achievement gap, sharing those with Asheville City Schools, just to get their feedback as a point of reference.
yes, I believe that they're ready to do that.
Is that,
We have that joint meeting coming up, I think that was in December, I don't know the date, but maybe we can put some of this stuff on the radar ahead of time since it's coming up really quickly.
Absolutely.
okay.
That's a great idea.
So let's just, for this year, let's just build that review in for those particular applicants, and then if we need to look at building performance measures in conjunction with them, or take whatever performance measures they're using, build in for that.
I think I will say this, so when we do get that information back, even though we're going through this cycle and it's not going to be concretely and this criteria that we're looking for isn't going to be on this cycle, I would personally probably, when we get the information back from the school board, the superintendent, what they deem success would be, I might necessarily personally apply that to the organizations that are applying, because if I already know that, and I already know that the school board and the superintendent may not deem something that somebody's doing as closing the achievement gap, I wouldn't be as prone to awarding money to those organizations.
recommendations were around setting aside money for capacity building, requiring 501c3 status for an application, requiring compliance with other North Carolina laws, requiring on the application some information about your governance structure, and then we're gonna build in the review of actual city schools for those groups applying for achievement gap. Did I miss anything?
I don't think we settled on the percent of the organizations, but we are wait for them.
Oh, right, I think for you to, so I think we do want to set a percentage beyond which the city funding, it can't be more than X percent of their budget. So, but I would say 50% is the top of that. And you all, maybe you can, again, look back at some of the applicants that we've had and see if there's something in that that tells us something that makes sense. All right, so that's my motion.
Second.
All right. And, oh, well, I guess I could. Right, okay, motion second, great, and you're in favor, all in favor, okay, great, thank you very much. And thanks, everybody, for your input on this. I think this is just gonna be an iterative process as we continue to try to, build up and strengthen the organizations that we've got here to do great work and make the best use of the city dollars. All right, moving on, next, Oak Hill. Dun-dun-dun. Michael.
Oak Hill, basically, that was a memorandum of understanding to help pass the painting process for the Homeward Bound project, which will be serving approximately 80 hard-to-house homeless. If you like, Brian, Homeless Services, person could possibly come up here for his. There we go. A little more detail on the project.
Good morning. So this MOU details the planning process. We're bound to do a conceptual site plan, to create a cost estimate for the project, do development and operational pro formas, and conduct a public engagement process over the next several months, at which time they would come back to council with a proposal for what they would request from the city to make this project happen and help us understand what their plans for actually creating this development. This would be for 80 units of housing for hard to house, our most chronically homeless population. Our by name registry of that population now is about 190 people. So this puts a pretty sizable potential dent in serving that population. Our clients need people who are frequently engaged in the criminal justice system, frequent users of emergency services, emergency rooms, and require frequent hospitalizations. And just provide housing for them really provides significant community impact.
Could you give me an idea of what the services would be housed for?
This is a housing first proposal, so there would be wraparound supportive services, including intensive case management based on their needs and vulnerabilities. There would be some office space that would be included with this for other agencies coming in that might have a potential interface with this population, behavioral health providers and other healthcare providers as well.
Any round of providers here?
My understanding is there would be two people providing support 24/7, and then of course, during the daytime hours, even on the weekends, the supported services staff would be available on site. And Homeward Bound folks are here and having particular Our request would be that it goes to council on the 27th for council consideration, so we can move forward.
Any public comment on this? Any homeward bound friends want to say anything? All right. Okay, is there a motion to move this on to council?
A motion to approve the proposal memorandum of understanding homeward bound with North Carolina for development and forward into the council's consideration.
Second.
We're all in favor? Okay, new business. Kirk Booth. Who's doing this? Okay.
And then I know Kirk is here, Kirk
Yeah.
will come up and be part of this presentation. So, hi Kirk, everybody know Kirk? Kirk is, as you know, a very active affordable housing developer in the community, and we've seen applications from him for housing trust fund. Kirk is now looking to be able to continue his process of making funds available for affordable housing development, and one of the ways he's been able to successfully do that is by refinancing existing properties, and then using funds from refinance to invest in new projects. Back in 2010, council approved and borrowed $200,000 for 12-unit cottage development on Bowcatcher, 444 Bowcatcher to be exact. Kirk agreed at that time to a 30-year covenant on that property, making all of those units affordable households to 60% median income, and has maintained that population and agreement since that time. Now, in order to be able to, again, continue to have the investment funds available, he's found a refinance opportunity for the first mortgage loan on that. But that mortgage availability does not allow for there to be subordinate loans. So what Kirk is proposing that we take the loans and the security interest from that property, put it onto another property that while keeping the covenant in place and the reporting in place for the affordability, even though we will not have a loan on that property. He's proposing to move to another set of properties. He's had those appraised. Even with the new, even with moving the loan over to those properties, the loan value ratio will be 70%, which puts us in a very secure position. All of his properties are 100% leased. They stay 100% leased. He actively has voucher holders, both housing choice vouchers and batch voucher holders who occupy his properties, so they serve an important role in that way in making affordable and secure and safe housing and relatively new housing available for those with the greatest need in our community. Otherwise, the terms of the loans that we have with us will change. So that's the proposal.
So Jeff, talk about what is the mechanism that will be in place to ensure that the Bowcatcher properties remain affordable?
There's a covenant, a recorded covenant in place, and that will remain in place.
Kirk, anything you want to add?
I just want to let you know that when we do this is a Freddie Mac long-term situation I've been fortunate to be presented with. And it does require me to put this property in its own separate LLC. So the name will change. But according to my legal counsel, the restrictions in D-Book 4836, 1679 go with the land. So it doesn't matter if it's still, if I change the LLC name, it's on the property itself. So I think we can facilitate it, it's just these new.
Any questions?
Sounds like a good project.
Well, I'm getting ready to submit a new application for 60 new units. It'll be all one bedrooms. They'll be almost 100% affordable. There'll be 48 one bedrooms at, half of those will be at 30% or less AMI, and the other half will be at 60% or less AMI. Then there'll be 12 in a great location. So that's your preview to mine.
Any public comments on this proposal?
That's great.
Okay, is there a motion to approve the transfer of the security All right, on to the thing that I think has brought everyone here today, our high impact site presentation. Who's going to review that? My name is Stephanie Rosendahl. I'm currently serving with Public by being the interim assistant planning director. And today we're going to hear a presentation from our consultants, Warwick Sargent and their sub-consultant team. At the end of this presentation, you should be on the same page as staff and the community who attended the public meeting last night, with all the information that we have learned today that are going to lead us to providing recommendations to you on December 11th. Just as a reminder, at the end of this presentation and after discussions and questions with staff, if it is not apparent what kind of recommendations might be coming to you and the type of policy decisions you will have to make, then we have failed at our job. So please let us know if you received enough information. Basically, we should be delivering a strategic plan for how to spend the $15 million of the affordable housing bond that you asked programs into the site. So that's you're not looking for any decision from us today. This is a presentation to set us up for making decisions on your recommendations next summer. You would welcome feedback because it will help shape the recommendations that we make. Thank you. What happens now? Are we gonna need to turn around and look at this?
Well, we are, yes. Or you are. We're already facing.
Right.
My name is Bob Deva. I'm with your lead consulting firm, Warwick Sargent. I think it was last month when we presented to you, we were on the phone. So it's great to be here in person, a lot less clunky, so we appreciate your patience on that, on last time. Needy is with me, Needy Guitar is also Warwick Sargent. She's actually done a lot of the heavy lifting here too. I don't want to minimize her role, so. And then we have Gary Mongian with us, who's our economic sub-consultant. So like last time, he's going to be a big, heavy part of this presentation and will be in a lot of the weeks. So it's a complex, we all in this room know it's a very complex issue. So bear with us as we go through this. I'm just going to quickly give you a little summary of what we heard at the public open house last night. And then Gary's going to jump right into some additional economic analysis that picks up sort of where we left off in our last presentation.
Hang on just one second. Is there a way to make these lights go on?
The other thing I do want to emphasize for anybody listening in or watching any of this, all of this will be available, I think, on the city's website, this presentation. And in particular, we had this public open house last night. We have 11 different sort of planning stations or boards to provide information that sort of went from the beginning of our process and just a lot of rush information that some of your staff pulled together on what affordable housing means, all the way through to some of the economic scenarios. So and that will be placed online as well too. There's a lot of information here, so we just want to make sure everybody has a full opportunity to see as much as we can. So a quick summary, and I apologize, we're a little shifted on the slide here, so hopefully things don't get cut off too much. But we did have a public open house last night from 4 to 7. It was a drop-in anytime you want. I will say this was pretty cool. We haven't had this before. At 4 o'clock, when we were just finishing setting up, there was people lined up outside with their faces pressed against the door. So that was great. We had about 50, I think, on the sign-in sheet. I'm pretty sure I wrote 50 to 60 up there. I'm pretty sure we had even more than that show up. A lot of people just didn't sign in. So and unlike a lot of drop-in open houses, there was consistent people and conversations all the way through from 4 to 7. There were no lulls or anything like that. So kudos to your citizenry for being engaged, not surprisingly.
That is never a problem.
Yeah, that's what I hear. So good for you all. Just a few quick highlights. As always, there's this is a little dangerous to kind of imply some big consensus points because there's a lot of nuance and everybody has different opinions. But we wanted to try to at least capture a little bit of what we sort of heard in broad strokes. This is a very complex undertaking, as you know, with a lot of details and a lot of nuance. And I think our goal was to provide education, and I felt like a lot of people really, at the end, once we walked them through things, everybody seems to get, again, not surprisingly, the nature of the issue of what we're trying to do. And I think people understood the difficulty of how to make these decisions, which was one of our big goals, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. This is difficult stuff. It's hard to just come up with big silver bullets that solve all the problems. I think people got that, so that was good. And that's that sort of understanding there's trade-offs and challenges. We did hear a lot of, as a reminder, we sort of have these design concepts that we're not saying this is the design, we're not prescribing to say this is the design, they're just something to give us something to model economically, but we think they're based on best practices and what we think the maximum amount of density we can get while still being responsible from a community perspective. And so we did have people comment on those. We showed those to you all last time. And I think that the general thing we heard, again, not surprisingly and in a good way, is while affordable housing is a big lift and we want to solve that problem as best we can't just do it to the exclusion of everything else. These high impact sites are part of the community. So people talked a lot about how do they connect to the community physically, socially, economically, that these are building community and doing community development, not just singular aspect of providing affordable housing. So that was interesting. I think we generally heard, again, not unanimous, but we generally heard, even though it's difficult and it's harder to spread the dollars this way, I think we heard people over and over sort of comment that having affordable units at a variety of income levels is important, so that it's not just hitting that top end and squeaking into some affordability. We're actually getting into some depth. Well, as Gary will show you saw last time, that comes at a cost. So, but I think we heard that. The other sort of thing, and we sort of talked about this a little bit, we've really come to the conclusion, I think, that the Riverside site is probably, of the three that we've been tasked with studying, is the furthest away, or the least sort of obvious choice as a big affordable housing kind of project to solve a lot of affordability issues. So it's still an important piece of the city's inventory, and there's many interesting things that can be done there, and you all will continue to work on that, but it's sort of slid down our radar screen. We heard that from the public too. That was sort of reinforced. So that's sort of the open house highlights. And then just, I won't go through these. This is as a reminder, sort of what we showed people. These are the same slides we showed you all last time we had boards. So these were the concepts of the two sites we really focused on for this open house, the Biltmore site and the South Charlotte site. South Charlotte site being a lot bigger. And I'm going to come back at the very end to sort of lead into some of the what we would call emerging considerations that are leading you towards policy recommendations, but not quite there yet. And I'm going to turn over to Gary. I don't know, Gary, you may want to walk up and do the screen if that helps. I don't know, it's up to you.
You're welcome to come up.
Just make sure you take the mic with you.
All right. Is this working? You good?
We're not going to be able to, I don't think we're going to be able to walk around with it.
So it just needs to stay.
It needs to stay there, yeah, sorry.
All right. I can, I'll just do it from my seat. Hopefully it'll work.
Just stand and then just stand.
Sorry about that. Based on our last presentation, you had a number of questions and asked us to look at some other things, so I'm going to spend most of my time focusing on that. As you know, we went through last time and just showed you the various scenarios we were asked to model. We provided some information about development economics of each site. Maybe go to the summary tables. Just a first general comment. I mean, numbers on a table aren't all that impressive. It's really about the math behind generating these numbers. And I just want to say that it's very difficult to kind of present, the math in detail in this kind of setting. I just want to tell you that there's been a lot of effort in terms of trying to model these projects accurately. The tools that we're developing as part of this are continuous. We're continually making changes, made changes 2 days ago to the models. And our intent is when we're done, it's the city's property. So you'll have access to those, and also doing this with the intent that these models will be used to evaluate whatever proposals you get back. So I just wanted to make that point.
units so that they're interactive and have the capability to analyze multiple scenarios without having to start and construct them all over from scratch. So that, that makes them highly complex, and I don't need to go into that detail, but I just wanted to let you know that there is a lot of math behind these numbers. Again, just a real quick refresher, the Biltmore Avenue site is about a $49 million project that would provide 309 units and 12,000 feet of commercial space. We're going to talk about the commercial space in a minute. We had a couple questions the last time of, does the commercial space contribute to the economics of the project? Is it good to have more or less? And we've made an effort to address that. These show the metrics. These three scenarios that we modeled were broad and that they crossed a number of income thresholds. They were fairly large in terms of the percentage of units that were affordable. The average, spread out over 309 units, the average rent we tested was about $785 a month. And each of these scenarios kind of a broad average. And the scenarios we modeled, we found that the subsidy costs per affordable unit ranged from a low of $57,500 per unit to provide 183 units to a high of 70,000 units if all were made affordable. And again, that's across the spectrum of income levels. So we thought it would be useful as part of this exercise to focus on two specific price points, the 80% of median and the 60% of median, just to show you the difference between that policy, those two policies. And we can just go through the other sites real quick. Phase one of Charlotte Street was $31 million. Of the three, we broke Charlotte Street into two phases. Biltmore Avenue was one phase. So if you look at this as three components of a large development, this component is the most difficult economically because of the amount, for a number of reasons, mostly parking costs and other site attributes. So this is the most expensive per square foot, probably the most difficult to provide affordable units. And go to the next slide. And then the second phase of Charlotte Street has the most development potential in terms of total units, 369 units. Could also support quite a bit of commercial space, almost 23,000 square feet. We use the same unit mix for each of the three sites. Ultimately, that may not be a good idea. Ultimately, one of these may have a different unit mix in terms of average unit sizes. Potentially you could do an ownership scenario on one of those buildings. These are things that can be decided over time. And the second phase is of Charlotte Street would be $62.2 million. It's about $193 a square foot in today's dollars. This phase would not happen. This would probably be the last phase to happen. So $193 a square foot, 24 to 36 to 40 months from now is going to be different. And again, shows you, again, applying the same scenarios, about 70 to 80,000 per affordable unit. And go to the next slide. So what we tried to do, based on your questions, was to do a couple of what we call sensitivity tests. We applied them to the Biltmore Avenue site, and the findings, proportionally, are probably applicable to other properties in the city as well that have similar development economics. So we tried to answer four questions. Just as a data point, what would it cost the developer to comply with the city's policy of making 20% of units affordable to the 80% AMI level? Again, just as a data point. And we applied that to the Biltmore site. And then what is the difference between going from an 80% of income to 60% of AMI? What's the additional cost? What's the delta between those two options? And then the third is what's the impact of allowing affordable rents to increase with inflation as opposed to being fixed, or either a specific inflationary cap or held at zero growth over a period of time? What's the difference in terms of the subsidy requirement? And then finally, we looked at the commercial space. Next slide. I know there's there's a lot of numbers on this slide. So basically, on a market scenario, this project, again, we're talking about Biltmore, would generate about $5.3 million in annual gross income when it's fully leased and stabilized. About $3.3 million of that is net operating income. Typically, with these kind of rental projects, about 60% of your revenues end up as costs, management costs, staffing costs, taxes, insurance, all those kinds of things. Typically, developers do these deals with the objective of selling them, sometimes within 3 years, sometimes within 5 years. Some developers are long-term holders, but it's important to understand what the resale value of the project would be. And as a market rate development held for 5 years, and based on the market rents we projected, it would have a net value of about $194,000 a unit as a market rate. So the 20% scenario is on the right-hand column. What it does is, by requiring 20% of the units to be affordable, that's 60 units, it reduces your net operating income by about 5%. It's still cash flows, that's a good thing. The main impact is it impacts your resale value. Assuming you have a long-term agreement to keep these units affordable, on a resale, it affects the development pro forma by $4 million. So it reduces the value of the project by almost 7%. So you can see the difference in the reversion value per unit averaged over all 309 units. It's about $13,000 a unit total impact. Concentrated on the affordable units, it reduces the value of each unit by about $67,000. So again, applying that, it has an impact of about $1.5 million on the total value of the project, which would be the cost of the subsidy required to make the developer whole. So it's about $25,000 a unit. In this particular deal, $1.5 million on a project, on a $49 million project, is only about 3%. So there's an outside chance in a best-case scenario that somebody may agree to do this without any subsidy at all. I mean, it's pretty close. So it's what it suggests to me is your policy applied to projects like this is pretty. Sorry, I keep doing this. So they're pretty reasonable and realistic as a baseline policy. The next slide goes through the same analysis at 60%. I won't go through each number, but the difference in rent at an 80% IMI versus 60 is another $200 a month in income loss to the project. So we talked about a $260,000 impact on the net operating income. In this case, it's more than $430,000. And the bottom line is to subsidize a unit at 60% in this particular project with, again, $190 square foot construction cost, it's about $110,000 a unit versus 67. So to go from 80 to 60, it's an additional $36,500 in public cost to make the developer whole. And again, you may find developers that are willing to eat a portion of that to do the project because it's a good project and a good site. But again, just some basic mathematics, somebody's going to have to come up with that difference. And again, it's just to give you some kind of perspective in terms of what's the difference of what seems to be a minor change. This 80 to 60, that's a minor change in rent, but it has a significant economic impact on the project. And again, you can debate the numbers. I mean, we could be off by 15%, but a 15% difference on a $110,000 cost is kind of at the margins. It really, we can be wrong and still be, right. It's a matter of perspective. Next slide. Allowing rents to escalate with inflation or at some prescribed rate of increase as part of an agreement versus fixing them. Actually, we ran the baseline scenarios with the expectations that affordable rents would be allowed to increase with market. I thought we had fixed them at zero, but that was not the case, so I apologize for that. But basically, the difference, and again, this is a switch in the model that you can use. You can set it at zero. You can say, well, we'll allow them to go at 3% max or 2% max. The difference over a 5-year holding period, which is what we modeled everything at, is about $21,200 per unit. So if you decide to say, you know, these projects cannot increase, or they have to increase based on AMI, and, you know, if in the next 5 years, area AMIs don't increase, and we don't really know, that's a $21,000 impact, an additional $21,000 impact per affordable unit. So that $67,000 we talked about becomes $88,000. So that's a requirement you gotta really think strongly about, and allowing rents to increase is probably, it's a compromise you probably need to make. Next slide. Okay, this is the interesting one, and there's another slide with lots of numbers, but I was really curious myself in trying to figure this out as to whether commercial space contributes to the bottom line of the project. And it's quite interesting at the rents that we're talking about for apartments. Maybe I should step back and just say what I did here. What I did was take a stabilized year income, which is about $5.3 million. That's total income the project generates, including the residential, including the commercial space. And we just looked at the components of that in terms of the overall size of the project. And of that, about $5 million comes from residential monthly rents, about $240,000 comes from commercial leases. Again, there's not a lot of space in the project, it's only 5%. Both products generate additional income. There is some additional income from apartments, things like, you know, there's just, every apartment project has ways of generating additional income in it besides monthly rent. And the additional income on the commercial space are basically pass-through charges, common area maintenance charges. So that's where that additional income comes, and then you see the total income in bold of about $5 million for the residential, $286,000 for the commercial. And on a per square foot basis, it's the same number practically. It's $20 versus $23. And we set the commercial rents at $20 a square foot based on the market set. Where it makes a difference is that on a residential side, about 60% of your income is taken in costs. Again, we talked about that, management costs, marketing costs, taxes, et cetera, whereas most of the costs of operating a commercial space are passed through to the tenants. So in terms of net income, the apartments generate about $8 a square foot in net income, again, based on the rents we projected, and this is a 100% market scenario. Whereas the commercial space is $18 a square foot net. So it contributes positively to the project. Assuming two key things, assuming A, you can lease it at these rents, and B, that the construction costs of the commercial space is reasonably close to the residential. In our experience in other properties, that's typically the case overall. The break even in terms of commercial rent seems to be, I did a bunch of scenarios here, it seems to be about $16 a square foot. So if your rents go below $16 a square foot at the construction cost we're forecasting, then it's a net burden to the project. It doesn't cash flow, it doesn't contribute. Above $16 a square foot, it's a good thing to have. And the ancillary benefit is that it supports the residential rents. People are generally willing to pay more in these newer apartment communities if they have access to services and amenities. So, and then the final point in terms of office space, there may be, we looked at possibly using a portion of the first phase of Charlotte Street as an office little bit more income off of that on a site that's very difficult to subsidize because of its cost, and maybe using those resources on the second phase to get more units, affordable units in phase two. So these are things we can do.
I know you have a question, but super quick, one of the reasons I just want to emphasize, I know you all asked about this, but one of the reasons we really wanted to look at this is it's a balance here of, the more commercial space we put in here, the less physical space we have to put housing, so you're losing, that's a trade-off. But we have been hearing consistently this notion of, if I'm just cramming a bunch of housing, can we make it a community place and amenities? So that's why we're trying to create a balance of at least some mixed-use development. Please.
So my question is, did you do this analysis, this is based on 100% market rate, did you also do it for the levels of affordability that we're looking at, and does it change significantly? It has to change, does it matter?
It helps, actually. You don't have to subsidize the commercial space, so it's going to contribute about $18 a square foot to your net operating income. So as you subsidize the residential or require developers to provide affordable units, that $8 a square foot average from the residential goes down. So the difference between the two grows. So what that tells me is that having a commercial component in these projects is a good thing, and it protects the developer to some extent from the cost of the subsidy. So it answers that question. The question of how much is enough, or is it, can the commercial space, by adding more and more and more of it, improve the development economics of these projects? The answer to that is yes, but at some point, fairly quickly, you get a trade-off, as Bob mentioned, that to add more commercial, you're taking out residential, and basically, basic commercial retail operations don't do well above the first floor, so you're basically in an office environment above the first floor.
The other double whammy there is commercial space is going to park at least more parking on a per square foot basis than residential, so it's not as simple of add 10,000 square feet of commercial, take away 10,000 square feet of housing. It's a little bit of a whammy there.
Yeah, I would just say that we did not attempt to allocate the full cost of the commercial space among, land and site work and all that other stuff. It was just, it's 5% of the total square footage. So this is based on an income as opposed to a cost of development. Our assumption is that the costs are going to be pretty similar per square foot.
I have two questions. First question is, how does including more density and building up to add more residential space to offset adding more commercial space, how does that affect the project? And were there any considerations, I don't think there were, but this kind of late after, considerations for how would an ownership opportunity that isn't subsidized, just complete market affect the project?
On the first question, going up, the way we structured the sort of concepts that we modeled were based on trying to get about as tall as we can get on what we call in the industry stick built, meaning it's based on wood construction with certain fire protections and things. At really going any levels higher than we were showing, you flip into probably requiring steel or concrete, and the added cost of construction there is so significantly higher when you do that, that it becomes very hard to build new housing out of steel and concrete unless you're getting crazy high rents. So we think that the model here is probably pushing the ceiling in terms of as much as we can squeeze on this site, but still at a construction cost that makes sense.
On the second question, going to a condominium or owner-occupied on a portion of the site, at a construction cost of, say, $190 a square foot, and then thinking about the additional amenity costs and probably parking and other things you would have to provide on an ownership scenario, and you have to make a profit on the sale of the units. So I'm just kind of guessing, we did not model model ownership on this site, but my guess is that you would need to sell those units at about $270 to $280 a square foot to be profitable. So if you can get more than that, if you could sell these units at $300 a square foot and your cost per unit don't go up dramatically, it may be an option. And the way Charlotte Street works is that there may be a portion, the developer can look at one of those buildings and say, well, we'll do condos on that particular building. Our recommendation would be to just lay that out as an option to whoever responds. And, you know, we would have the ability to look at the viability of that. It's all about the numbers of units that you can sell as condominiums. They're still very difficult to finance as a developer. You've done some, you are doing some in the city, so the market's starting to change. Other places we work on a multifamily building, you just can't do condos. You just can't. The number of pre-sales just makes it prohibitive. But you may be able to do it here. So our recommendation is to leave that as an option and see if you want to encourage it, you know, to give added points for somebody that wants to do owner occupied on a portion of the site.
Yeah, that's a good segue to jump ahead just a little bit. We've been talking with staff, again, we're not at a recommendation stage, but I think one of the things that we've been talking pretty detailed with the staff on is the notion that all of this analysis and study is really good for you all to be able to evaluate development proposals, but we have to be very careful probably on how much prescription we do put into a development proposal. There are other ways to slice this pie. Gary mentioned companies that are holders, so there may be nonprofit developers that hold these over a long time that might be more favorable ways to get a little more leverage your dollars. And we don't want to cut off that by having such a really prescriptive RFP that creates these very tight conditions under which people can respond. So there may be values in the RFP, there's more value placed on X, and the more affordable we can get, and we're willing to put in this amount to subsidize, but we want to, there's a fine line here. Real quickly, just to pull it back out a little bit, that level of numbers and charts and details, we didn't do an open house last night, just, as you can imagine, that's, I'm sure everybody followed every number in there, every last little detail, it's very complex, so one of the talking points for us here is, it's hard to, that's why there's experts like Gary that do this. We're hopeful that his level of really deep dive gives you all confidence in what's happening behind the scenes, but it can be very complex and hard to explain out simply. So hopefully that at least gives you some confidence that we've done some really deep dives in the background. To pull it back out, we've been using these kind of slider bars as ways to help convey some of this, and even this is very complex, but we walked through this with many people in your public at the open house last night, and I think it was helpful. So these were those base scenarios. They're not the sensitivity tests that Gary did, but the base scenarios we looked at last time, and trying to compare those two sites from different levels. And this is really trying to get at this notion that we were trying to convey to people, and I think you all get already, is that there's trade-offs. And you can look at what you're getting out of affordable housing in a couple different ways. So these sliders are sort of the farther to the right the better, the farther to the left the worse. You have the two sites, and you've got these three base scenarios. Scenario D was that just base policy of 20% of units at 80% AMI. So that's sort of the base that Gary did talk about, and we just showed that for Biltmore Avenue. But the gist is, one way to look at it is just, well, how many affordable housing units are we getting in these different scenarios? So if you're just looking at pure quantity of units, that scenario B, Biltmore gets you 309 units. They're all in affordability, because that scenario slanted that to 33% and 60 to 80, and the rest 80 to 120. So from that scenario, that's a very positive. You get 309 units are affordable. However, the other way you could look at it is, are you getting a deeper level of affordability? So some of those scenarios don't have a lot of units in that 60 to 80%. You have a lot in the 80 to 120. So you may be getting a higher quantity, but you're not getting the depth of affordability. You go to the next one, Dee. The other way to look at it is, well, just how much gross dollars would we have to come out of our affordable housing bond funds to make these scenarios work. So, that scenario B on Biltmore Avenue, yeah, you might get 309 units, and it was a pretty deep level of affordability, but goodness gracious, are we gonna spend almost all the bond funds on one project? I'm not sure that's gonna make sense from a public policy standpoint, so that's a big trade-off. And then the other way to look at it is, well, some of those ones, like on South Charlotte Street, are relatively low gross amount you're having to put into the project compared to the others, but on a per unit basis, it's pretty high. So it's a lot of trade-offs. I think intuitively, people sort of get that the more units you want and the deeper level of subsidy you want, the more money, gap financing, we would call it, is gonna have to go into these. So it's just a series of trade-offs. You go to the last one, and I know you may still have a lot of questions, but this is sort of where we are. The overriding takeaway is something everybody, I think, in this room already knows. Affordable housing is hard. There are no silver bullets. You can't put a little teeny bit of seed money in and hope it grows into a massive amount of affordability and affordable units. And I think I've been encouraged, at least in other cities we work, people don't get that. They always think, well, somebody's already solved this problem. How do we do it? It's not that hard. Go figure out who else did it. And I think you all are sophisticated enough, and I've been encouraged that pretty much everyone I've talked to has sort of gotten that. So that's a big hurdle. Doesn't mean your all's job is that much easier, but I think people at least understand that. But there are some tough decisions ahead for you all of where in that continuum do you want to get in terms of overloading one or two projects with the money versus getting enough affordability and deep enough affordability. Riverside Drive, again, I think we've hit on that one, but I think that's pretty clear recognition that that's probably not your number one high profile site for affordable housing. We are more and more believing that Biltmore Avenue should be your first project out of the gate. When we analyze the site, when we look at the economic analysis, when we consider what's going on at Lee Walker Heights, there's already momentum and movement. There's a roadway that connects those two. There's opportunity there that's probably ready to go much quicker than the others. So we think that's going to be a major recommendation, is move very quickly towards the development RFP in first quarter 2019 and get that one going first. As we all know, the clock is ticking, so I think it's time to really ramp that up. South Charlotte Street, we still think is a good site. Has a little bit more economic challenge. The site costs are a little bit more. It's a big site, so it has to be phased. The challenge there, of course, as everyone knows, is we have existing city facilities in place. On the plus side, you own the land, which you don't at Biltmore, so there's that consideration. However, I feel like, and I think your staff feels like, we don't have enough information yet on how easy it is to move those city facilities off. What are those costs? Are those costs that you're going to have to spend regardless? In other words, the cost to relocate some of those services are something you're going to have to be out of pocket on no matter what, so don't consider that affordable housing money, or do you have to spend the money to move them, and you would only do that because of this. So there's some analysis and study, and I think Nikki and Stephanie have already started looking at it and talking to some consultants about how to look at that, but that would be sort of phase two. So phase one, build more, get that going, and then while you're doing that, do your own internal look and study at a much more detailed facilities analysis so that you're operating with really good information. And then again, this overriding thing, which I keep hitting off, and I think everyone gets, is just trade-offs, trade-offs, trade-offs. So we really think you're going to need good partners on these things. We would strongly recommend that you don't try to solve all the world's problems yourself. Everybody's in this together, so you're going to need partners, and you should be leaning on them heavy to help you all. So, on Biltmore, are there opportunities to partner with the hospital in ways that they have workers that have the same affordability issues and commuting issues, and if you're developing a project right next door, maybe there's a way they can materially participate. Duke Energy, I know you all have an option on that property for a fixed amount. If there's any way to get that amount down, some, all, maybe, that sure helps. Every $1 million that you see makes a difference. South Charlotte Street, we hear over and over from the public, and they're dead on. The quality or character of that street is not conducive right now. That is a a big divider. It's a river that flows through with East End on one side and everything else on the other. And this project creates really big importance and pressure on changing the character and quality of that street. But of course, that's a state street, so, or a state-owned street. So there's another partner that ideally there's some capital money that we spent to change the feel of that street to make it easier to cross, slow down traffic, make some new traffic signals that ideally they can participate in materially so that you're not carrying that burden. So, but that's a lot of information. We take any and all questions.
I would love to ask a question, okay? So I know that we have been trying to get a mix of as many deeply affordable or more affordable units as possible, but we also have learned a lot about having a mix of incomes within a certain development that helps close achievement gaps, it helps with community issues. So can you speak to, when we talk about what that mix should be in terms of the percentages that you have that are around the affordability range, so that we have a community that achieves some of the social needs that we have?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we're big believers, and I think many people are, in the notion of mixed income and having that stratification, and there's social benefits to that. There's economic benefits, but there's also social benefits. I don't think there's an absolute prescription of this is the precise mix that does that. And as you see, there's big economic impacts. I think ultimately that's where we're going to be in the next month, working with your staff to start to refine some of that, to make recommendations of how big or what a range that might be to do that. So I don't have a clear answer for you. You got to have at least 10% of the units at 60 to 80 or something like that. But having a mix helps. The other thing that's important to remember on these projects is these are a very specific kind of project. They're urban apartments. There's going to be small, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments. Your affordability gap on the whole, as a city, has many people that aren't going to be in those kind of places. You have families with kids and larger things, and those aren't going to be the kind here. So that's the other mindset here. We've got to be careful. If we overspend all our money in one place, we may be creating some affordability, but are we only creating it for a certain kind of renter or user, or if it's all rental and not ownership, that kind of thing. So, anyways, it's a good question, Kathy, and we're going to hopefully spend the next month to maybe provide a little more framework for you all to make that decision.
I've got a couple of questions. Number one, you said the clock is ticking on the Biltmore site. Are you referring to the fact that the Lee Walker project is moving forward and ideally there would be some synergy?
I was referring more globally that your affordable housing bond fund clock is taking as much that you have to, money that you have to spend, and these projects, these two in particular, which really are probably 3 phases, you're not gonna do them all at once and overload the market. You're gonna have to do them in phases anyway, so the faster you get that first phase going. However, that point on Lee Walker Heights is a good one. There's some synergy there for sure that can be taken advantage of. That development is farther along, and actually I assume probably will be using the Biltmore site as some staging area and some of that kind of stuff, so.
And remind me, Jeff or Kathy, so our investment in Lee Walker is, a lot of it, or maybe all of the most of it, isn't it around the creation of that road connecting Lee Walker to Biltmore Avenue, that infrastructure? So, okay, all right. And can someone remind me the mix of units that are going in at Lee Walker? I know it's going from 96 to 212. Are they all going to be the deeply affordable, or there's going to be a mix there too, I think?
All of those units are going to be 9% tax credit units, so all are going to be affordable to households with maximum incomes of 60% of median income. Some of the units, the replacement units for the existing Lee Walker units are going to be voucher holders, so those will be households at 50% of median income or less.
And I'm sorry, just a good point. This relates back to what Kathy said, that I think is another consideration, particularly for Biltmore, is we should be thinking about that as a collective. So when we start thinking about that tiered income, we should be thinking both of those together, as they're going to be coming online very, very comparable time.
And they are.
And they're physically connected, absolutely.
My last question is around the question of the rents and freezing the rents versus rule on that right now? Is it, do we, I mean, if we give housing trust fund money, we make that loan, and those units always have to be affordable to people at X% AMI, then the rents can only change as AMI changes, is that right?
That's our current policy.
Okay. Would there be a reason to change that on, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but.
Well, I think there's a couple considerations. One is that while every pro forma, based upon common practice, even North Carolina Housing Finance Agency requirements when you submit an application for tax credits, will show a 3% annual increase in costs and a 2% annual increase in rents. The fact is that even in private sector developments, rental increases are market-based, they're not AMI-based, and they're not formulaic either. If the market can bear an increase in market rents, then rents will increase, and that depends upon occupancy rates and quality of tenancy and, the needs of the ownership and what they think the market can bear. So you don't see an across-the-board, and I think you'll confirm this, that you see it as a pro forma. I think the difference is that while those market rates are market-based, generally are affordable rates, we will quickly, if there was an annual escalator that the developer felt that they could put in place fairly soon, within on your fingers number of years, those units would no longer be affordable to the intended households. It would create a situation of rents that were too high. And in fact, that has happened, particularly for fixed income households that have been in affordable units that have been created through conditional use permits. The rents escalated to the place where those households at times have been involuntarily displaced because the owner of the property had the ability to raise those rates beyond the ability of those persons to afford them. That's a very difficult issue to resolve in terms of having private partners in these kinds of deals.
Questions?
I think it would be wise as part of this RFP process to think through how this mechanism is going to work. I think you have some flexibility. It doesn't necessarily have to be identical to what you're doing now. But you obviously want to have some mechanism to preserve these units for some period of time. I don't know whether it's 10 years or 50 years, but I think that's, or forever. So we have to, I think if you want proposals, you got to state what the rules are as easily as you can as part of that package. And then they'll do their own pro formas and figure it out. The reality is that on a 20% scenario, the developer's going to look at this and say, well, for me to subsidize 20% of the units, the math works typically on a 300-unit project, I raise everybody else's rent by 7%, and I break even. So the question is, can I get away with that? Can I do that in this market? And if they like the location, if the market's strong, sometimes they'll make that judgment. If it's not, they won't. And yeah, market rents, they bounce all over the place. They bounce, based on the economy, it's based on supply. And there's a whole bunch where we work in Atlanta, there's just a whole bunch of supply coming on right now. So that's going to have an impact on market rents. And it's very cyclical. Nobody was talking about affordable housing for the most part in 2010. Everything was affordable in most parts of the country. It only took 5 years to get economic conditions, and this problem exists everywhere. So it's a moving target, and I think we can be of assistance in just trying to lay out some kind of easily explainable framework. These are the rules developers that we're going to propose. This is our definition of affordability and how we're going to do it.
Questions? So what would be helpful? I mean, do you want to hear from us, yes, we think the Biltmore Avenue site makes I mean, one thing I will say just from that conversation is, I mean, it is important for me that the city's investment in affordable housing lasts a really long time, and that, you know, we don't want those units that are affordable now to eventually become unaffordable. So while there may be some flexibility from our current policy on tying those affordable rents to AMI, I think if we want to achieve our long-term goals, I don't see another way to do that. So that's my opinion on that.
So staff is looking for review our comments like that, which is, what are the council person's preferences for length of affordability with this project? After seeing this, how do you feel about the affordability mix and what kind of targets we're looking at, either by percent of number of units that are affordable or by the levels of affordability? And now that you've seen it, we'll be likely recommending that you put your chips down on the Biltmore Avenue site first. You would, speak to that in conjunction with how it works with the Lee Walker Heights redevelopment.
I think this is very important as we're moving forward to spend affordable housing bond money. And this sort of decision, in my eyes, I feel it should be elevated toward council and not to just this committee. I feel like having such an important conversation should take place on a larger scale than just in this room, and I wouldn't be comfortable making any sort of recommendation at this point in time, but getting it on a council calendar and making sure that all council members have good access to the information and are very aware of the information for their council meeting, to have a very robust conversation on what they want to do. And, we're kind of heads up on everything because we get it first, but I'm not comfortable having this sort of level of conversation in this room, just us three council members making a very important decision where I feel every single member of council, including the mayor, should be in on that conversation.
And because of the time restraints that we have, I don't think we should, really have time and space for any reconsideration. So I believe moving forward to council for, just full evaluation from this.
So the plan had been to come back to us in December and then go to council when?
Actually, are coming to council on December
On December 11th,
unless you choose to take that off.
So the plan was not for it to come back here, for it to go straight to council, which is your point. And I think this is one of the biggest decisions that we'll make, so I agree with that. Since you asked, I would opine that I think I agree that the Biltmore Avenue site is the place we should put our chips at this point. One of the early slides showed, a subsidy for 183 of those 309 units being 57,500 as opposed to 70,000 in the other, on the Charlotte Street site. So, and again, there's lots of variables in that. And I don't remember if that was at 60 or 80. Way too many numbers for my simple brain. But that seems to make sense to me. The commercial space seems nice. That area could use some, I think, could use some more commercial investment. I've already talked about my view on the rent. The 60 versus 80, I mean, I just need to study those numbers more and spend some more time with that.
Yeah, and again, we haven't gotten all the way there yet, but my guess is where we'll head with that is, as a recommendation, will be something more, again, to keep it simple and whatever would be to say, we think the city has, we have this much we're willing to put into this project. So tell us what you can do. Our goals, we want a tiered income, we want some at this, we want a deep level, enough subsidy, we want enough units and sort of create some value savings, so then you can evaluate, rather than having to do the brain damage of saying, we want exactly this many units, exactly, A, that's hard to do, B, it leaves a little more flexibility for developers to approach it different ways, for you to then to say, well, this is the best way that we're getting the most out of it.
Can I ask a question? And I'm assuming that subsidy amount that you estimated at this point in time is all sources of subsidy. It's not,
Correct.
we say city right now, but that does not mean necessarily that all of that subsidy is sourced from city bond funds.
That's exactly right. It's a gap, however that gets done. And in some cases, you have value in land, like in Sarah Street, or you may be able to work with Duke or others on Biltmore to attack that gap. It's just a gap. So using the word subsidy, probably not the right term.
Yeah, and the other concept is that assumes that the gap is closed at the time of construction. It's an infusion in the capital cost, which reduces the equity requirement, reduces the borrowing requirement. If there's a source of, income to replace, the income loss on an annual basis, that's a different way. Other communities have used tax abatements. I don't know if portions of these projects might qualify for the 4% tax credit. It depends, but there's, we have the ability to model that as well.
At what point in time can we expect to see this at council?
December 11th.
December the 11th? I would welcome anybody in the audience and anybody who's watching streaming to contact me and let me know your opinions on the matter and where you feel we need to go and really have an in-depth conversation with myself. I'll make myself completely available as much as I can to talk to any and everybody. So please reach out to me any way you can.
And I'll also note that, kind of to the point that you made, Keith, about council members learning about this information, there are 3 sessions scheduled for Friday morning for us, I believe, is that right?
Yeah, there's an opportunity for all council members, and we also presented to PED, and we'll be talking to the finance committee.
So there are other opportunities. Since we do have a little bit of time, I just want to ask if there's anybody in the audience who has either a comment, question for our presenters. Yeah, Kurt, come on up. I need you to come up to the microphone now.
Can you go back to the one slide with the expenses on the, I think it was the, there you go. Can you tell me what's in the expenses? You said operating expenses at 60%? Is that what you said? What is included in those expenses?
Hopefully everything.
That's not debt, too.
No. Net operating income is before debt service. That's what's available for service.
Anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
I guess one of the things that I'd like to see is input to where some of the people at Lee Walker, or people who are low and moderate income, have some opportunity. I also looked at it, that it may be an opportunity where social enterprise, like you said, the commercial space, I always look at things like that, sort of like a social enterprise that helps to underwrite costs. But I guess my question is, why isn't it that a transit-oriented development wasn't thought of? People always talk about parking decks, but we're trying to get away from cars. I mean, I just see that as something that we need to take a look at, because there's a lot of commercial opportunities in a transit-oriented development, and even we could take Biltmore, and then, like, if that's phase 1 or whatever it is, then we think about an innovation district as we hit South Charlotte Street going over into Charlotte Street. We talked with some of the commercial people on Charlotte Street about that. So I'd like to see it, and I'd like to see more opportunities available to folks who have been displaced and sort of moved out of commercialization. And because it's more than being a warehouse and a building, and having somewhere to live. You also need a place to apply your trade. So thanks.
Anybody else?
I would love to, go ahead. I would love to see you've shown us these numbers to the extent that you can. If I could get access to, seeing the more detailed numbers, I'd appreciate it because I like this kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Oh, you'll love this then. Amazing spreadsheet stuff.
And then the other question I had is, at the December meeting, when you're going to bring it to council, is it going to be this level of detail or not? Because I can't get with you tomorrow, because I have another
Yeah,
commitment.
I don't think we talked about it yet, but that's something for
What would
staff.
be council's preference?
Yeah.
I think this level of detail is very important. This is not some fly-by-night decision. We're talking about long-term, millions of dollars. People went out and voted in trust that we would handle taxpayer taxpayer funds with these sorts of projects and do it in a way where everybody knows what's going on. That's just my take. I think it should be high level.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say, some of us on council, I will put myself in this, for whom this is about as much as, again, my reptilian brain can handle. There are then people like Gwen and BJ who get lost in spreadsheets, so maybe.
We don't get lost, we love that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean get lost in a bad way, I meant get lost in a good way. So maybe, you know, a presentation like this, at this level for council, but again, making those spreadsheets available both on the city's website and, you know, to council for anybody who really wants to dive that deep, but, yeah.
I think also it's not necessarily what council's preference is, because a large segment of the community may know somewhat about this right now, but I guarantee you there are gonna be way more people than in this room that are gonna show up and go, we haven't heard about this, we haven't seen this, and if you just kind of do a gloss over, you're like, well, where's all the other information? Even though it's been around, you're not just addressing council, you're addressing City of Asheville, all those who are in surrounding areas who like this sort of stuff and want to be educated towards it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe going back and pulling some from your previous presentations that kind of set the groundwork a little bit might be helpful too.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was assuming. You gotta sort of start from the beginning.
Right.
Show, you may not get in all the details of the existing condition analysis, but we looked at these things and that's led to then digging this.
And is there any way that we can let the public know that this is being recorded? Will the sessions tomorrow be recorded as well?
I don't think sessions tomorrow.
No, no, they will not, but we can just say that, in addition to being able to go on the city's website and look at the HCD committee materials, Megan, make sure that all the presentations are up there. We also have, this is really easy, asheville.nc.gov/city property. You can find all of the information on city property redevelopment at that site. And then if you want to know more about affordable housing and all of the tools, including the $25 million bond program, you can go to asheville.nc.gov/affordable housing.
Any other, and I'm just gonna sort of morph this into public comment now generally, so any comments or questions about this presentation or anything else?
Joe Hartswell. I would like to, excuse me,
Pull that microphone up just a little bit.
kind of tie off of Councilman Young's comment. I'll definitely try to reach out to you guys for brief comments. I agree, this is a project that, you know, hopefully will last for longer than, say, 30 years or 40 years. And from that standpoint, I think, you know, some things perhaps should be put into the RFP, and I know this is going to, especially for someone like yourself, the numbers thing, ideas about sustainability, and not just the building itself, but the property. I mean, the Matthews Ford site has a lot of impervious surface, and what can be done about that, and some of those longer term things, because if that building is going to be there for 50 years, then that infrastructure needs to stay in place for 50 years. So, and I don't know, and so this would be another question is, so when it goes to council, will that be, where will the RFP come into play? I guess, and will there be any input from that? I mean, at least perhaps from planning and zoning.
So the current idea is, that in December, we would like to recommend to you that you authorize staff to create an RFP, and then we would come back to you. It's not an RFP, really what we're doing is asking for you to consider making that property available for development, and then in January, we would come back with a process for how to make it available, including, initial guidelines, perhaps pretty well refined about what an RFP or RFP would look like.
In the way that we've done for Cedarville and Billiards. Anybody else? Yeah, Nicole?
Thank you, Nicole Heimba. I just, I wanted to, this has been a really long and dense meeting. So I want to apologize to, before I add a whole bunch more kind of things for thought. But I actually wanted to go back to the subject of the achievement gap. I think that what Dee said about the achievement gap in Asheville as compared to the state of North Carolina is really important. And I want to say that I think we need to be careful in not assuming that programs that are working to close the achievement gap are going to actually be able to do that. Because the programs that are working to close the achievement gap are working on harm reduction. Those are harm reduction programs. They're working with children who are already systemically placed at major disadvantages, and they're working to provide them with additional supports and services in order to help them hopefully overcome these incredible barriers that are placed all throughout their lives in other ways. Harm reduction strategies do not solve the problem. They are not addressing the root causes. They're extremely important. We have to pull the babies out of the river. We don't want to let them drown. But we also need to find out why those babies are being thrown in the river in the first place, right? You have to do both. So I just want to be really, I want to think a little bit, or encourage us all to think a little bit about the achievement gap, because that is a canary in the coal mine. How our children are thriving or not thriving is indicating how our people are thriving or not thriving, how our families are thriving or not thriving. And honestly, if Asheville has the worst achievement gap in the state of North Carolina, Asheville is failing its Black residents, families, and children. So I want us to think about, what are the policies? What are the school policies? Yes, but what are the policing policies? What are the effects from previous policies of this city, of urban renewal? What are those effects? We're doing so much in the realm of affordable housing, and we're doing a lot of this really good work. But I really encourage us to take a step back and look at the totality of that pie, of how people are being affected, and where are the policies that can be changed. And not just thinking exclusively, and I'm not implying that y'all are, but just to say, not thinking exclusively that achievement gap programs are going to actually fix the achievement gap, because it's a much, much bigger issue than that.
Anyone else? All right, with that, anybody got anything else from you? Okay, great. I think we are adjourned, and thank you all very much, staff and consultants.